We're going to get moving here in just a few minutes. If everybody could come in and take a seat. For those of you online, please bear with us. We're about to start soon. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all of you here at IFPRI. We're going to start the program here in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. A very warm welcome to all of you here who can be with us in person here at IFPRI, and also to all of our audience that is joining us virtually. We're really pleased to gather all of you together for today's discussion. So in addition to welcoming all of you to IFPRI, I just wanted to give a little bit of an idea of what we're trying to do here for the half-day event. We know that we're going through a period of great change and some uncertainty. And we're also here during a very busy two-week period, the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. So between those two very busy agendas, we thought it really would be important to have a event squarely focused on hunger and malnutrition. There's so many competing priorities and different agendas that are being discussed that this focus is really why we have decided to hold this meeting today. And we're just so grateful that all of you are here to focus on really what is the most important topic for humanity. I'm so grateful to the World Bank, in particular the Agriculture and Food Global Practice, who have partnered with IFPRI on this event. And we thought it was important to literally keep our eyes on the road, to keep this focus on hunger and malnutrition at such a crazy and busy time. So we've brought together a very diverse set of speakers from the policy-making community. We also have representatives from the scientific community, NGOs, private sector, international organizations, and philanthropic organizations. And thank you, all of you, for agreeing to join us today to speak and to exchange on these important topics. There will be 3 sessions today. We have an opening session that is to help sort of take stock of where we are. A second session, we are pleased to hear from a number of policymakers and international organizations that are in town for the spring meetings. And then the final session is going to take a deeper look at value chains and in the agri-food sector and how those contribute to improving livelihoods and by extension also contributing to alleviation of hunger and malnutrition. For those of you joining us virtually, we welcome your questions and comments through your various platforms. You can do so on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on X. And those of you here with us in person, of course, we have the mics and you can queue up to make your comments and ask your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Ruth Hill, who is the moderator of our opening session. Thank you, Ruth.
Good morning, everybody. As Charlotte said, I'm Ruth Hill. I'm the Director of the Market, Trade and Institutions Unit here at IFPRI. And I'm really delighted to be here moderating this opening panel this morning. So we're 5 years away from 2030, which is the year by which the world had committed to ending poverty and hunger. This was an ambitious commitment when it was agreed to, and it looks even more ambitious today. We've not had much progress at all, with setbacks, often undoing the gains that have been made. And looking forward, as we see cuts in ODA, trade tensions, higher temperatures and more erratic rainfall for many of the world's poorest, it looks challenging. So even though we all may agree this is really challenging, I think we all also agree that we can make more progress than we are and that this is an important priority. And in this panel, we're going to focus on what faster sustainable progress might look like, and in particular, how this can be financed amidst a growing competition for limited resources and international financial order in need of reform. So we've got three fantastic panelists to help us think through this big challenge and to get us focused. To my right, we have Maximo Torero, the Chief Economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization. Prior to his position at the FAO, Maximo was an executive director on the board at the World Bank, and he was also the previous director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at IFPRI. To my left, we have Shobha Shetty, the Global Director of Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. Prior to holding this position, Shobha held various positions in agriculture, social, urban, rural, and resilience practices across the World Bank and has seen the challenges for multiple parts of the institution. And then finally, Jo Swinnen, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, also holding many other positions at the same time, Commissioner in the Food Systems Economic Commission and Governing Board Member of the World Agricultural Forum, to mention a few, but there's many others. And prior to being at IFPRI, Jo was a Professor of Economics and Director of the Lycos Center for Institutions and Economic Performance at the University of Leuven in Belgium. So thank you very much to all of you for being part of this panel. And I wondered if I could turn first to you, Maximo. The FAO closely tracks progress towards several SDG indicators. And could you give us an overview of how things look for SDG 2, which is zero hunger in 5 years in 2030?
Sure. Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation of being back at IFPRI. Yeah, I always have to bring the bad news, but let me give you some of the numbers so that we are aware of where we are. So in the SOFI that was published last year, the new SOFI will come in July this year. We were referring to a midpoint of 733 million people in chronic hunger. We were referring to 2.3 billion people that lack regular access to food. 2.8 billion people that didn't have access to healthy diets. And then in the crisis hotspots report that we produce also twice a year, we were talking of 281 million people in acute food insecurity, which the concept is different, is short-term, while the others are more medium and long-term. Now, if we project the number of hunger that we had in last year to 2030, that will mean that we will be in a 581 million people by 2030. So very far from the zero hunger number. And this number was 130 million higher than what it would have been without COVID-19. So what we need to understand to put this in context is that the numbers start to deteriorate even more because we have COVID-19. Then we have a smaller impact because of the war in Ukraine, which was an exacerbation. And now we have a lot of uncertainties which could complicate things in the future, especially for the continent which is doing the worst, which is the case of Africa in terms of changes. No? Now, but we need to also look at what is happening at the sub-regional level at different regions. No? And as I said before, Africa keeps increasing, the number of people in hunger. The case of South Asia is improving. In the new SOFI this year, you will see a significant improvement, especially driven by one big country. I cannot say the number and the name, but it's a very big country, which will improve the numbers substantially. But the case of Africa normally will remain the same. The region that had continuously been improving after COVID-19 has been Latin America, especially South America. And I always say it's the only sub-region, because it's South America, not Caribbean, Central America. It is the only sub-region that could reach the target of 2030 if they continue the same pace. So we keep seeing that pace in the future. So that's the good news. So that region decreased in the last SOFI in 0.7 points the POU, the prevalence of chronic undernourishment. So it's a significant change, and seems in the future SOFI the numbers will continue in a similar direction. The same is not happening for Central America and for the Caribbean. The Caribbean especially were mostly affected. Now the other indicator that we track is of course the cost of access to healthy diets. As I said, 2.8 billion people that don't have access to healthy diets. And that of course is different across different regions. And interestingly, of course, there are some discussions around the number. The case of Latin America is the biggest cost of all the regions in terms of the cost of healthy diets. And in this SOFI, we're looking at that very carefully. And we are also looking at the price transmission because we saw that there were different elements of the price transmission. And just to finalize, when we measure the amount of money that was required just to handle the POU, so one of the two SDG indicators of SDG 2 related to hunger, 5 years ago, we were talking about of $330 billion more that were required. When we did the same exercise last year, we were talking now of $540 billion more that is required. So the cost of not doing things has a significant impact, and we need to look at that very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximo. And so sort of picking up on that last point, which is the increasing cost of the need for action. Shobha, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask you if you could briefly speak to the role of the World Bank and other international financial institutions in providing development assistance to low and middle income countries to help them move closer to the goal of zero hunger.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks to you and IFPRI for this event that we're co-organizing with them. It's great to be in IFPRI. As Maximo said, I mean, the news is not good. And, we are, after many decades of progress, steadily drifting away from the zero hunger goal. And as Maximo reminded us, almost 300 million people are now suffering acute food and nutrition insecurity. And what's worrying is that this has been increasing over the last 6 consecutive years, and driven by a perfect storm of conflict, COVID, climate change, and other economic shocks around the world. And it doesn't help also that our food system generates, creates more destruction of the planet than the value it generates, driving a dual combination of undernutrition as well as rising global obesity, generating a third of global greenhouse gas emissions while really putting unsustainable pressure on water and forest resources. But we all know, at least those in the room and those connected, we know that the solutions do exist and the business case is clear. So growth in agriculture still remains 2 to 3 times more effective at reducing poverty than any other sector. And every dollar invested in nutrition yields a $23 return in improved health outcomes and productivity. And investing just $260 billion a year over the next 5 years to cut current agri-food greenhouse gas emissions could generate returns of the order of $4.3 trillion in 2030, which is a 16-to-1 return. So this is the vision that the World Bank Group has in mind, essentially to feed people now while building a system that fosters growth, creates jobs, and preserves the planet. And we've become one of the largest sources of development assistance in this area, supporting both immediate interventions like national social protection programs, but long-term investments as well to promote healthier and more sustainable food systems. First, let me start with the ambition. By the end of June 2024, the World Bank Group had helped strengthen food and nutrition security for over 200 million people through its active portfolio, and our aim is to reach 327 million by 2030. Over the last 5 years, we've directly financed $22.3 billion for food and agriculture, of which $3.6 billion supported resilience measures. We also committed $3 billion in new financing in 2024, with over 40% of commitments delivered in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're now working to mobilize resources at scale, combining knowledge, advice, and a gamut of financial instruments. It's sovereign loans, it's guarantees, it's insurance products, to de-risk lending and to attract investments into the agri-food sector. But we all know that these financial tools work best when paired with public sector policy and regulatory reforms. So we've been working very closely with over 40 countries now to repurpose harmful farm subsidies and ag supports to channel them to support more sustainable, inclusive, and productive outcomes. And we are also rapidly growing innovation in our portfolio based on foundational knowledge partnerships that we have with organizations like IFPRI and CGIAR, rigorous science and other research organizations to generate and scale innovations our clients need. And lastly, let me say that we remain committed to supporting our client countries as they navigate this very, very uncertain international environment. And our projections show that up to a 4.7 decline in global agri-food trade under a scenario in which trade barriers continue to accumulate. In summary, our mission is to really build the foundations for a food system that not only nourishes people and supports livelihoods, but also makes it possible to feed and keep next generations out of poverty.
Thank you, Shobha. Shobha has spoken about the international financial system. Government and public budgets of donor countries and lower middle income countries provide another very important source of finance for the fight against poverty and hunger. Could you speak to the trends and outlook for development assistance, and what is the outlook for low and middle income countries making up some of this shortfall via their public budgets?
Thanks very much, Ruth, and a big thanks to Shobha for collaborating on this event, on the preparation, and on making this happen. I think it's a really important event, just because everybody of you is here, but also it's hopefully the start of kind of an institutional arrangement that we would do this at the whenever the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, that we would try to host a series of panels on that. Talking about basically donor funding and also, I mean, it's a bit tricky with a lot of donors in the room, okay, and financial organizations, both from the public sector and the philanthropic and the private sector. So let me try to set a bit of the general scene and then make a very specific example, okay, as an illustration. I think right now we are probably experiencing history. I guess we're experiencing history every day, but we're experiencing history in a particular way. And with everything that's going on, particularly a lot of it originating here in Washington, D.C. But I think we should also look at this thing as probably an opportunity to question what we have been doing, to see how we can make changes going forward. It's clear that the status quo as we had it up till, let's say, a couple of months ago was not delivering what we want to have delivered. And I think Maximo gave a good summary of that. So it's not even delivering the zero hunger society, and it was certainly not delivering a sustainable, nutritious society in the days that we had planned it for. So I think it also allows us an occasion to rethink, okay, and to see how we can use the opportunity to do better or to make changes that lead to the better outcomes in the future. In the media, there's been references to seismic events that are currently, or a seismic moment. Well, the thing is, when you have an earthquake, right, it can cause trouble, definitely trouble with cost changes, but it is also the result of things which are happening, structural things which are underneath, okay, tectonic plates moving in the world. And I think we have to look at, I think we have both happening right now, okay? And so, for example, if you look at the donor landscape in traditional donors in Europe, for example, there you see structural changes which have been going on for several years, which are now, depending on whatever election is happening, what country coming to the forefront, but going very much in the same direction, which is reduced funding, or reduced growth in funding from traditional donors, and in addition to that, since a couple of years, less share going to agriculture. Although for all the reasons that Shobha explained, I mean, this is, we don't think that's a good thing, okay? Now, we also see there's quite a lot of new emerging capital in the world, funds in the world, and that comes from different countries, okay, which are growing up in terms of economic development and therefore are willing to step in, but they are not necessarily stepping in the way we have traditionally seen it, so we have to take that into account. I think also in terms of the public versus the private sector, there's a lot of rebalancing or basically structural change taking place, and of course philanthropy is an important part in that. So IFPRI exists 50 years this year. We are finishing up our global food policy report right now, and part of this has been rethinking on this. And so we think both in terms of what it means for food system transformation and for our own institute and for the CGIAR more broadly, okay, which are different things, but both types of structural changes are very much there. Let me briefly give an example, okay, to see some of the changes we see globally developing, which is on agriculture and food R&D spending in the world, okay, and so we've seen very big structural changes, and I think they also, to some extent, are reflected in some of the aid flows that we've seen. There's been a significant reduction over the last 20 years in, or leveling off, depending on the country, of the traditional donors invested in this area. At the same time, we see significant growth in funding of ag and food R&D in new countries. For example, in Europe and the US, about 20 years ago, they were spending roughly $6 billion a year on this, okay? China, India, Brazil were around $2 billion, okay? Between 1.5, 2.5, so 3 times less. Right now, China is outspending all of them in terms of things. We've seen significant growth in India, in Brazil also taking up, while there's leveling off in the traditional donors. At the same time, though, we see that private investments in ag, R&D, and food has really picked up. So in the US, for example, we see between 2000 and 2015, the ratio of public to private was roughly 2, okay, twice as much public to private. Right now, the private is double almost of the public one, okay, big changes taking place there. And then the issue is what's happening, for example, in Africa, okay? And there you see, so we keep, if I looked at the numbers, typically I emphasize that they are, almost all the African countries are below, about 80% are below the target of 1% of ag GDP that is set as a target, really to have major, basically, spillover effects in terms of growth and poverty reduction, etc. They're on average at 0.5%, and it fluctuates a bit, but it's going down. But if you compare with China and India, it's not that bad, because China is at 0.6%, India at 0.3%. So it's really around there, okay? So in a way, I mean, you can interpret it both ways. In a way, it's clearly not enough, but at the same time, it's not completely out of line with these things. So I think there's an element there. And my last point is, how can we do better? I think there is what we can certainly do better. I mean, there's a lot of debt overhang in all these countries, which really constrains not just investment in ag, R&D, but certainly also in things like school feeding programs, social protection, etc., nutrition. But at the same time, there's a lot of funding which is out there, $800 billion in the world. Most of that is in rich countries and China. But still, there's a lot of, if you look at the share of public funding going to not productive, not sustainable subsidies, okay, I think there is a lot of potential for making that better as well. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in another question to each of you. We would also like to get some questions from the room, so I'm going to ask you to be really brief in the responses, although the questions are going to remain just as challenging and big. Shobha, in an era of tightening budgets and rising needs, how can countries and governments better align resources, priorities, and delivery to ensure progress?
Thanks, Ruth. So let me, I think, start from where you left off. I think first, in this era of tightening budgets, we first need to improve the quality of investments. And much of that work begins domestically. I think, everyone talks about, oh, we don't have, money, we don't have money in our budgets, but there is a lot of money in countries' budgets that actually goes into harmful subsidies or unsustainable ag supports that could be repurposed. Even 10% of repurposing that generates almost $2.4 trillion by 2040 if we put that into greener, healthier innovations, thanks to the studies that we've done together with IFPRI and FAO. And I think the good news is that the momentum for real food systems change at scale is happening around the world, right? At COP28, we had 160 countries that signed the landmark declaration to integrate food and agriculture into their national climate plans. And provided the conditions are created by the countries to really create the right ecosystem for agribusiness and agri-finance, as Yo himself mentioned, there is a large amount of patient capital that can really help the sector really achieve the transformation that it deserves. And at the bank, I think we are now working towards becoming a more efficient, a better, and much more coordinated institution to really help us sort of reach these goals. We have a new Global Challenge program on food and nutrition security that focuses on high return catalytic interventions, scaling proven solutions, and supporting countries to prepare, prevent, and respond to food crises. And we're leveraging almost $5 billion in our active portfolio to really double our commitments to connect smallholder farmers to finance and markets over the next 5 years. But let me finish. I know we're running out of time, but I think what we need more of is really sort of more partnerships and a much more unified and cohesive food security and nutrition financing architecture. So we have plenty of action all over, but it's often weighed down by high transaction costs. And we need to really overcome this fragmentation and scale impact. So we need much more coordinated, programmatic approaches that align funding behind country-led priorities, pooled financing, multi-donor trust funds, platform-based investments can all reduce transaction costs and channel larger and more strategic flows where they're needed most. So we have Scaling Coalition, for example. It's a great example of bringing the World Bank, CGIAR, FAO, and other partners together to really move evidence and innovation into practice. So let me stop here. I think the key really, as I said, is really getting these partnerships that can have a much more unified and cohesive approach to address these multi-sectoral problems across food and nutrition.
Thank you. Before turning back to Maximo, I was wondering if you could just spend a minute or two speaking about the role of capital markets and the private sector, which are also very important sources of funding to get to zero hunger.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. A minute or two is probably a bit short on that. We have the president of IFAD coming on the next panel, so I'm sure he'll talk about capital markets. And so what you see there in terms of, if you look at the investment in sustainable and development characteristics of the food systems from capital markets, it's growing, but it's still fairly small. I think it's about 8% right now in terms of magnitude, and it's mostly concentrated in high-income countries. I think everybody agrees there's a number of innovations needed to attract more effective capital in it, not just talk about it, but do it. The CGIAR, for example, has launched a number of research initiatives on innovative finance. We've had a number of blended finance initiatives. I know the World Bank and IFAD have both now sustainable development bonds, and I'm happy to learn from them, okay, how effective they've been and progress there. In terms of private sector, you know, the private sector is more important than ever. If you look back to 20 years ago, I mean, the role of the state in food markets was much more elaborate, much more intrusive than it is today. We have, I'm just going to, given the time here, elaborate on one point, and this is together with Lorraine Ronke, and Lorraine is around, oh, she's over there. And she's chairing actually I think one of the third panel today. Together with Lorraine and Tom Reardon, we worked on the role of value chains in basically in financing for climate, really in the agri-food sector. And so we have a paper out in Science, just a couple of comments actually a few months ago, where we really make a case that this is an area where a lot of people kind of refer to, but do not really grasp how potentially huge this is and potentially important. When I worked at the World Bank, I counted, it was 20 years ago. It feels really makes me feel old, okay? We were then looking at the role of value chains, it was called supply chains and not value chains, in basically modernization of agri-food systems, okay? And we felt that we were working at basically Central Asia, most, and East Asia, South Asia, that was really, really important. Then we looked at Africa and Latin America, and we felt and we saw that also there the evidence that was available was that it was a huge vehicle for technology and finance to the farm sector, okay, and an underappreciated one. So I think also today, if we can think about climate finance, everybody complains there's only 4% of it is going to the farmers, 0.8% is going to smallholders, okay, and the issue is why not more? And I think the essential problem there, it's a mismatch between the supply, which is a much larger basically packages of billions of dollars, and the demand side, which is in much smaller packages, which is just, I mean, I don't know, hundreds of or thousands of dollars really. So how to make that thing, and value chains can play an extremely important role in that, we believe. This will not happen by itself, okay, so we need a policy environment that's conducive to that in terms of giving the right incentives, working on the risk, supporting innovations in the system, and also making sure there's a fair distribution of the benefits then, because the same thing which makes value chains attractive, because they're large, they're organized, they're linked, make them also potentially dangerous in terms of extracting all the rents from the system, leaving nothing for the small. So for that, where policy in various ways can play a very important role. But I think that's an area where we really have to spend more time on, including IFPRI in terms of some of the research of backing it up.
Thank you. So we've got the biggest question left for you. So, I mean, I think we've been talking about how we can see faster progress in the next 5 years, but as you know, we're also aware that we need to start looking beyond 2030. And I wanted to ask you if there was early thinking within the FAO and the UN on how we, you know, how things evolve after 2030 and what the main priorities are that you're seeing.
No, sure. Let me answer in three blocks. So in the short term, our goal is to change the trend, no? The trend of hunger, the chronic undernourishment indicator. So what we are hoping is that as soon as we can turn the trend to a negative, so meaning a reduction of hunger, that will be ideal, and then we accelerate as much as we can. So we don't want to ignore the 2030 target still. We want to keep it there. We keep running simulations with it and trying to see how we can do. My expectation in the very short term, we will start to see a change in trend despite the different challenges. Let's hope it doesn't go up again, but at least I hope soon we will see an improvement in that sense, which is great. The second component, I think, which is super important, is to understand that we call it agri-food systems because it's not only food, it's also non-food activities that create income and therefore food access. The agri-food system is working under an environment of risk and uncertainties, and I think in the last years, the COVID, the war in Ukraine, what we are observing today is bringing more clarity that there is a lot of risk and especially uncertainties that we cannot predict and therefore we cannot ensure. So that's the world we are operating. Therefore, anything we do in the future, we need to understand that and we need to look into a world of options. Agriculture is no longer static. I cannot plan as before, this is what I am going to do, because no, it's changing all the time. We know that the frequency of climate events will increase, the intensity of them will increase, no matter what we do in the short term. it already will happen. If we do good things in the future, okay, it could be 10, 20 years from now, we will go back to normal, but not immediately. So that's the second concept where we are looking at. And the third one is one that looks at intertemporal. So we're not only thinking of the right to food today, which is reducing hunger as much as we can today, but also the right to food tomorrow. So what we call good food for all for today and tomorrow. And the intertemporality, normally we forget, and we look at the present, and we try to achieve the goals in the present. And that was mostly the 2030 agenda, because you have a lot of SDGs, but they were not interrelated between each other. And that's the agenda of looking at an agri-food system that will deliver food, but will also be able to deliver food tomorrow to people. And that's the sustainability part. That's where the climate, that's where the soil, the water, the natural resources are so important. So everything we do now is a lot more complex than just the SDG 2. It's complex because we want to assure that sustainability for tomorrow, and that's our emphasis. And yes, it is true that we need to get more financing to that. And there are many sources of financing. Of course, some of them are changing and the dynamics of the financing is changing. But I think we need to bring the different buckets together, because private sector by itself won't do it. Private sector will always be asking for some support, from some de-risking, or for some political stability to be able to act. And that requires policies, requires institutions and government. And the multilateral banks, of course, they can contribute, but they have to be catalytic and they have to coordinate across them to be able to achieve what we want. And climate financing will be central. But we need to understand that this agri-food system that provides food for today to you, provides the right to food, is a good thing, no? We can eat. Therefore, we need to be careful and care that it can also provide it tomorrow. And that's where climate financing comes into our role. And we compete with energy financing, because both are the sectors that create the major problems on the climate. And that means that if I have to issue a bond, it's easier to issue a bond on an electric train, because I know what will be the return. There is evidence. It's very palpable for people to buy for that bond. In agriculture, it's a lot more complex, no? It's a very complex sector. So we need to work intensively on that to create that transparency of the instruments that will allow us to attract that climate financing, because the 4% doesn't make sense. It needs to be a lot bigger, because it's the only sector that has a space to shrink. So that's our objective right now, is trying to look at that good food for all for today and tomorrow.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, a round of applause for all the panelists, I think. I know we are at time, but I'm just looking to you, Charlotte. Are we allowed to take it? We're allowed one question. Okay, great, here. There's a microphone just here.
All of us have a lot of questions in our minds, but I wanted to try Weiler here again, the Global Alliance to Improve Nutrition. You know, it seems to me that what we need right now is to have several brave international institutions to come together and tell us not just the human misery cost of what's going on now, because unfortunately, not too many people in power are caring about that, human misery and death. But what we need is brave institutions to come together to say, here is the economic cost, here is the growth cost that is going to be the result of the decline in aid, of the trade war that is to come, on multiple things, because that is the investment case that countries need and that businesses need to say, if we don't stand up and do this, countries are not going to grow, we're not going to have markets. You know, that sort of really hard-hitting economic analysis. I think if a group of brave institutions could do that, I think it would help us out a lot. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to change my mind. A second question. But that's it.
Just for the record, I've been forced to do this. My name is Michael Wirtz. I'm with the Munich Security Conference in Washington, D.C. And running the risk of being the party pooper here, I'm a lot more concerned, and I feel a little more urgency than I felt on the panel, with all due respect, because I fear that there's several things at play, that there are a lot of externalities that are affecting the global system that are relatively difficult to calculate and to game out over the next 2 or 3 year period. And we know that the stability of the system is severely undermined. My impression was that neither at the Raisina dialogues in Delhi nor at the China Development Forum you could have the impression that China or India, or their functional elites for that matter, are strategically capable or willing to think about a greater overlap between national interest and global good. So I don't see any help from that sector coming. The economic argument is a very strong argument, and Maximo, I know that you're making this argument in the most eloquent way. The Mexican government has made that argument over 15 years here in Washington, virtually to absolutely no political avail, because again, the political narrative and the rationality of the argument are two separate things. And I fear that this is also true, Joe, for the private-public partnerships, because you will insist on financial inclusion, on equity, on having investments in agri-food systems that are viable and diverse, and all these words are now kind of prohibited. And I feel that, or I see that a lot of private sector actors are preemptively making sure that they do not run afoul with the new political environment that they're seeing. So I feel that we need to come up with new strategies and get invested in even more conversations. And what we do at the Munich Security Conference, if you allow that brief pitch, is that we try to move aggressively into the military and defense and national security factor, making the argument that food security is national security, that weaponization of food is a strategic challenge, in order to have a medium-term conversation 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, where we can maybe argue successfully that parts of our defense budgets that will grow, whereas the development budgets will shrink, need to be allocated and designed as unified national security budgets, so that other institutions can draw upon these massive funds as well, because I personally don't see any other way of compensating for the hundreds of billions of dollars that we need to invest in equitable food systems over the course of the next decade or so. Just wanted to put this point out there, hoping that I provocative enough to get a funny response for
You can. Okay, let me start. I've never been so much invited by the World Bank to respond. Okay, let me start with Anne's point first. And we are trying to do that. Okay, in terms of a calculation, we actually have we had a blog out on the impact of the tariffs. The first announcement of the tariffs came out last week. I think Joe Glauber is on the third panel, so he's leading a team. I mean, he's co-leading a team. Valeria is maybe in the room, who's part of it. And so and then the moment a blog came out the day after the tariffs were changed. Okay, I don't know if there's a causality there. But we just yesterday have a new blog out with a new impact, okay? And so we continue to work on that. Obviously, we're also working on the impact of the cut in funding, how that's affecting several countries. And we have one or two cases out already right now. Okay, so we're trying to help in that way. And the blogs are on our website, so you can look at them right now. On the point, Michael, on the broader issue, okay. I think that you will not have, I don't think so, basically objection from us for the idea that food security is global security and is defense security and national security. I think we would all agree with that, or I certainly would. It's something that hasn't been emphasized so much. It's just kind of been assumed in a way, but now it's much more central to it. On how it's affecting the global system, I think the main point right now, if you look, I recall in 2007, 2008, when prices spiked, everybody talked about the price shock. And shock means deviation from the normal, right? Because prices have been relatively stable for the 20 years before. They were low most of the time, actually. Now, if you look back at price evolutions in the global, it's been volatility all around. Okay, it's been up and down and things like that. So there is a lot of, and so I think the way private businesses, value chains, but also countries are looking at the system now, it's much more one with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of volatility. And so you need a strategy, a resilient strategy in your food policy to deal with that. I think if you see how value chains have reacted to the COVID shocks, basically, I think they've been much more resilient than given credit for. Initially, indeed, it was, you saw in the media these pictures of long lines at the border with produce on the trucks, which was rotten and things like that. But overall, if you look back, they've adjusted, they've diversified, they make sure they're no longer depending on one particular source of supplies. I think countries are doing the same thing, particularly with the Ukraine war, Ukraine-Russia war as well, because countries like Egypt, which were really depending for core commodity on one thing are now diversifying. And in a way, what you see now is another shock, which reinforces the need for diversification, for resilience building in as a strategy. So I don't think it's that different. And so a final point I want to make on that is that the thing from the policy perspective, the FAO, the World Bank, IFPRI has been emphasizing the problem. One of the problems about reinforcing the shock was basically export constraints introduced by food exporting countries. What you have now is the opposite. It's import constraints, okay, which have the opposite effect. They push prices down, not up on global markets. So in a way, it's a very different effect, but at the same time, it's similar in the sense of adding uncertainty and things like that. So I think in that way, I'm not sure if I'm more optimistic than you, but I think people are coping with it and developing strategy around it.
Only to add, I don't think I was saying that there was no urgency. For sure, there is enormous urgency. All my numbers are terrible. But the point is, what is the biggest concern? And I don't think it's an issue of heroes also. I think it's an issue of evidence. And we need to be very careful of the evidence we bring now, because we cannot just throw numbers over the night, which are wrong, because things are changing too fast. And I could be pressing enter to my model to get a result, and the next minute my numbers are different, and completely different because of the way things are going. And we learned that a lot during the time of the Ukraine war, because people rushed with things that didn't happen at the end, and we had to clarify that. And it was a significant problem. A lot of things go under the scenes, because sometimes that works a lot better than coming out publicly and showing things to people. But in any case, so let's focus. I think we need to focus on substantial, solid evidence of what are the consequences. So for me, what doesn't complicate my life a lot is $7 trillion were removed from Africa over the night, okay? That has a consequence in health, in nutrition, in all these dimensions, okay, what we can do. But at the same time, I think Africa needs to change. Africa needs to pick up their responsibility, and I was very happy to hear the president of Zambia, for example, the way he was expressing how they will move forward, given the current constraints. And that could be a good opportunity to accelerate an efficiency. And there are many countries which are cutting ODA right now. It's not only one, it's many. Every country we talk cuts and cuts and cuts. So I think we need to find a way that the post-Malabo program and so on accelerates, and countries start to take their responsibilities finally, you know? This president of Zambia was telling a story that I see every day when I travel. He was saying, okay, I was traveling in business class while my donor was traveling in economy class behind the plane. That doesn't make any sense, no? We need to take care of the money, we need to use the money properly, and it was the president saying this, and he was able to recover from the drought. So I think we have to help countries with evidence on how they can do the repurposing of the resources that they have, how they can attract more private investment, how they can create an enabling environment to accelerate private investment so that private sector can go in, because there will be business. What will happen in the trade world if things continue as they are, you will have a split of the spaghetti ball. So today we have a spaghetti ball that everybody knows in trade, but this will split in two. And clearly it's what is moving to, and we need to work on that and see how that will operate. And as Joe said, not necessarily this will imply higher prices, because if you go into recession, there will be less demand, and prices could go down. So we don't know yet the net effect, and there are first round effects, second round effects, and so on and so forth. So I will be very, very careful, and that's why understanding risk and uncertainties is the best of the times now to work with that and to figure out what would. But the evidence will be central, and our job is to bring the most solid evidence within our limitations, so that we can help governments to do that.
Thanks, Ruth. I know we're running over time. I think uncertainty is sort of the norm of the day. I just want to make a couple of quick points. I think one is that developing countries today trade far more with one another than they did a generation ago. So as of 2023, nearly half of exports from these economies went to other developing economies. So that's promising, and which also opens up several options. So one, I mean, the first point is, liberalization is across all partners, and developing countries would see higher output if they responded by liberalizing instead of engaging for tit-for-tat tariffs. And this is with regard to all trading partners. Second is really sort of deepening cooperation, and we talked a lot about Africa today, with willing trade partners. So in Africa, we have intra-regional exports could be doubled by 2035 if measures to facilitate trade and investment under the African Continental Free Trade Area are fully implemented. And in East Asia, We have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, along with the liberalized rules of origin, could increase trade among the 15 member countries by up to 12%. So, and of course, supporting a rules-based trade system would be fundamental. But as just to reinforce what Maximo said, I think we are going to be, providing the best evidence and analysis available. I think our next global forecasts on this are due in June. But yes, the dialogue and the process of trying to establish a level playing field will definitely continue from our end as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists again for really setting us up well in terms of keeping our eyes on the roads, getting our eyes on how we end hunger and malnutrition and some of the challenges, but also the opportunities that are there to see faster progress. So thank you once again.
Hi, everyone. We're going to move to the second panel. I'm Purnima Menon, Senior Director for Food and Nutrition Policy at IFPRI. So I'd like to invite the panelists that are in the room to join me here. Alvaro, please. Rania, Arnel de Mesa, please. I will introduce you all. We have two panelists that are online. Welcome. I thought you were going to be online, but you're here in person. Fantastic. So then we have one panelist who's online. Let me just kick us off with a few words, and then I'll introduce the panel as well. I thought that was a really stimulating first panel of discussions, and for me, it just really brought home the value of what we do in sort of the global community does in bringing people together, shaping the discourse in different settings, be it at the World Bank IMF meetings, the G20 meetings, COP30, G7. The more we see sort of horizontal coherence of the issues that we care about as a global collective, the solving of hunger and malnutrition issues across these different meetings, as well as from global to national, I think the closer and closer we get to getting the kind of commitments, the kind of actions, the kinds of investments that you want to see across the board in ways that are coherent, impactful, and evidence-based. So what we have today is a panel where we'll hear about these different settings. We'll hear about the work that different organizations are doing in the context of that. We did a review about a year or so ago at IFPRI, actually, on the ways in which global commitments and global convenings, the ways in which they play out to deliver impact and the kinds of things we need to keep our eyes on the ball. Danielle Resnick, I don't know if you're in the room, Danielle, was one of the researchers at IFPRI that led this. And I think for us, the biggest takeaway from there is the importance of both horizontal and vertical coherence in terms of issue positioning and the unfolding of that. We have a busy panel, so I'm not going to take too much time in introducing us. We'll have at least one round of questions or comments from each of them, and if we're lucky, we'll get Charlotte to allow us to have a few questions as well, okay? So I'm very pleased to introduce John Steenhuisen, I hope I got that right, the Minister in the Department of Agriculture in South Africa. I think we may have met at the N4G Summit as well. Thank you for joining us here today. We have Arnel de Mesa, who's going to speak from the perspective of the Philippines and from a very particular part of the issues that relate to agri-food systems, which is what happens to critical staple commodities. Thank you for joining us here today as well. We have Alvaro Lario, who's the president of IFAD. You play a really important role in shaping what happens in rural development actions and investments around the world. And so we'll hear from you. France recently hosted the Nutrition for Growth Summit. We're very happy to have you here, Gilles Morelato. You're the head of Overseas Development Assistance Team with the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. if any of you were in Paris, it was an absolutely bang-up event in terms of commitments, and so we'll look forward to hearing from you on that. And then last but not least, we'll hit the issue of humanitarian assistance, really something that I think is top of mind for many people as we're thinking about what unfolds in the world. So we'll be a busy panel. We'll cut from global to local to regional. We will hear from organizations that are shaping discourse, starting with the Global South or with the Global North. And we'll cover a wide range of topics. Across the board, though, I think a common thread will be around both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead of us. So without further ado, let me invite you, John, to speak about really from the perspective of South Africa hosting the G20. I know you're having a busy time organizing and pulling all of that together. So thank you for joining us from there. I'm just wondering, the G20 is a really important meeting in terms of providing that over time coherence of issues, especially in the context of agriculture and food security. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what you're bringing from the South African presidency and the ways in which you're carrying forward these issues, including if you would like to touch on how are you providing that over time coherence of the issues as they've unfolded from India to Brazil to now South Africa? So over to you. You'll have about 5 minutes. Thanks.
Well, thank you very, very much to everyone who's there, and also to yourself as the panel, excellencies and colleagues. And thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to join this important dialogue on this topic, which is both deeply human and profoundly structural, and that is the enduring crisis of hunger and malnutrition. And for South Africa, food security is not just a question of production, it is about access to food, affordability and equity. We're obviously an exporter of fresh produce, and we, across a variety of sectors, world-class citrus and macadamia. And yet, even within our own borders, many households still go to bed hungry. Our most recent national nutrition survey that was conducted by the Department of Agriculture found that just over 1/3 of households are food secure in South Africa. The rest are navigating a daily struggle, often invisible in data, but painfully visible in our classrooms, our clinics, and communities. And malnutrition takes on a dual face in South Africa. In some places, it manifests as stunting and wasting in young children. In others, it shows up as diet-related diseases driven by overconsumption of high-calorie, nutrient-poor, starch-rich foods. And this is the paradox of the modern food system: surplus on one side, scarcity on the other, overnutrition and undernutrition sitting side by side in the same country, and in some place, the same communities. And it is with this context that South Africa is approaching our G20 presidency. And it comes on the back of two very strong presidencies, both by India and Brazil, and Brazil's particularly excellent work on the Global Alliance Against Hunger has left that lasting legacy. And we are obviously picking up from where Brazil left off, and we are weaving that work into the food security string in our G20. And so our leadership of the Agricultural Working Group is being treated by us with a strong sense of urgency and responsibility, given the work done by India and Brazil previously. Our national agenda in agriculture is closely aligned with the G20 priorities, which are solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and all of these have rootings in agriculture. And we are focused on 4 strategic pillars within the presidency, and the one is obviously, and within our national agenda. One is improving inclusive market access to strengthen food and nutrition security. Secondly, empowering youth and women across the agri-food system. Thirdly, fostering innovation and appropriate technology. And fourthly, building resilience in the face of climate change. Now, each of these, you will realize, is interlinked, and each of these are the touchstones of the hunger and nutrition challenge. In our view, reducing hunger must begin with correcting the structural exclusion that keeps small-scale farmers, particularly women and youth, on the margins of the system. Without secure land, fair prices, access to inputs, and real participation ability in supply chains, we cannot expect communities to feed themselves with dignity. And so our G20 agenda calls for targeted public and private investment in inclusive market access. And this includes climate finance that reaches smallholders, not just high-level pledges, but on-the-ground catalytic instruments that are able to support production, storage, and the local distribution of food. Secondly, we need to stop treating nutrition as an afterthought to agriculture. I think for too long, agricultural policy has been about tonnage and exports, while public health struggles to correct the dietary consequences. What South Africa is doing is now working to align its agricultural investment with national health goals. We're supporting many traditional crops like amaranth and sorghum, both of which are nutritionally dense but also climate resilient, and building public procurement pathways that prioritize these healthy foodstuffs over heavily processed imports. Nutrition must shape what we grow, what we subsidize, and also how we educate the next generation. Third, we believe that this is a moment to invest now in small-scale innovation, not just the high-level tech disruption. Technology is, of course, part of the solution, but the real innovation lies in how we train, connect, and empower farmers at the farm gate level. And so South Africa's vision for G20 cooperation includes expanding access to farmer-led research, participatory learning, and the rollout of digital tools that are designed with, not for rural communities. And we support the G20's call for knowledge sharing, but we also want to ensure that African farmers are co-creators in this innovation ecosystem and not just passive recipients of external know-how. Lastly, the climate threat to agriculture is not theoretical. It is immediate. And South Africa has experienced erratic rainfall, rising heat, and more frequent drought cycles. And the knock-on impact on rural livelihoods, especially in arid zones, is profound. So we're committed to advancing climate-smart agriculture, but we're also calling for the financing mechanisms that take the risk off the most vulnerable. If climate adaptation finance doesn't reach subsistence farmers, then we are simply managing decline rather than enabling resilience. I said recently, colleagues, at the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Paris, which was an excellent coming together and a terrific event, that food security is not just a slogan. It is actually a social contract. It requires a long-term commitment, practical solidarity, but also political courage. And that is the lens through which South Africa will lead during its G20 presidency. As we look ahead, let's use the G20 platform to match our policy frameworks with coordinated investment. And let's use our influence to ensure that food systems are restructured around people and not just profits. And let us also be remembered as the generation that chose to act, not when it was easy, but when it was necessary. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely inspirational. Yes, you have a round of applause in the room. I think particularly for reminding us that this is about human dignity and the right to good food and good nutrition at the end of the day, even as we work through the other parts of the system, and also for reminding us that the structural determinants here are absolutely central for us to work on. Let me now invite you, Arnel, to speak to the issues of rice in the Philippines. Really, sure, yes. We know you have some slides. Yes, so please go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Firstly, apologies. Our secretary should be here, but due to unforeseen events, he has to leave last night in the order of our president. Again, good morning, everyone. I'll be talking on how transforming the rice sector reform agenda can contribute to ensuring food and nutrition security in the Philippines. Can I have the slide, please? So Firstly, the Philippine rice sector plays a crucial role for the country's food security and livelihood. It is a staple in every Filipino, recording an average per capita consumption of 122 kilograms per year. This is twice as much as 55 kilograms annual average. And rice farming remains as the primary source of income, especially in the rural communities. Currently, we have about 2.8 million rice farmers in our registry, producing about 19 million metric tons on average from 2017 to 2014. And cognizant of this rice industry's economic and social importance, the department is focused on building resilience and stability in addressing climate change, establishing convergence through farm clustering and consolidation, and promoting rice sector digital transformation. The Philippines is situated along the western edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire and the Pacific Typhoon Belt. The country's agri-sector is particularly vulnerable to natural disasters and the effects of climate change. Extreme weather disturbances and unpredictable climate patterns significantly alter local ecosystems and affect the yield stability of our staple crop. With this, we are prioritizing the adoption of alternate wetting and drying methods, provision of renewable small-scale irrigation projects, and strategic positioning of seed reserves all over the country. The Philippine Institute for Development Studies also highlights a agri-credit as a lifeline for our farmers and fisher folks that were affected by calamities. To ensure the availability of financial support to farmers, our secretary recently launched the Agri-Puhunan program, or we call it the Agriculture Capitalization Program, which provides low-cost credit for agri-inputs, insurance, and subsistence allowance to our farmers. Ultimately, it aims to attract bigger investments geared towards agricultural production, making it more bankable sector while encouraging new generation of farmers. Along with food security is the department's goals to ensure that nutritious food is available, accessible, and affordable to many Filipinos. High poverty incidence is correlated to the prevailing unhealthy diet and practices, which in turn is suspected to be the cause of chronic diseases in the country. Data from our Philippine Statistics Authority revealed that the bottom 20% of the country's population spends 58% of their income on food, of which 22% is spent on rice, while only 7.9% is spent on fish and only less than 5% on vegetables. The prevalent diet observed in low-income communities is rice, fish, vegetables. But as income increases, this shifts dramatically to a more protein-based diet. We therefore acknowledge the critical importance of providing rice at a more affordable cost, especially in areas with high poverty rates, in order to facilitate a transition to healthier diets within low-income communities. This is why our budgetary support and investments in the department is focused on these areas. The department also identifies diversification as a key strategy that will improve farm productivity and sustainability through adoption of technologies and adaptive cropping calendar to transform rice monoculture landscape into an ecology-based diversified farms. The department also leverages on agri-research to address food insecurity and malnutrition by promoting improved rice varieties. The adoption of high-yielding and resilient rice genotypes can increase the yield by 15 to 20%. The Philippines also became the first country to approve commercial cultivation of nutrient-enriched rice, a biofortified variety with increased levels of beta-carotene to improve the vitamin A requirement of young children. Furthermore, the department has recently collaborated with the International Rice Research Institute and produced the low glycemic index rice. This initiative seeks to mitigate the escalating incidence of diabetes and facilitate the transformation of commonly consumed varieties into low and ultra-low GI alternatives, all while maintaining high-quality grain characteristics and and never compromising overall yield. On another note, while rice being a key commodity was highly responsible for the country's inflation, which soared to a record high 24% last year, March 2024, the escalating rice prices and inflationary pressures prompted the government to issue Executive Order number 62, which practically reduced the import duty for rice from 35 to 15%. These policy changes complemented with a more stringent enforcement against rice hoarding and price manipulation, as well as leveraging on technology-based rice stock movement and inventory, created a more stabilized consumer market in the Philippines. The inflation started to decrease downwards, starting the end of 2024, and just recently, March 2025, we saw the biggest decrease in inflation to negative 7.7%. So given the role of the Philippines in the rice global market and trade, the department's policy reforms echoed and created a ripple effect coined by the market analyst as the Laurel effect, named after our dear Secretary Francisco Chu Laurel Jr. on the rice market landscape worldwide. Global rice prices had significantly decreased in the past months and is forecasted to further improve, creating a more stable market and efficient global rice trade. In conclusion, the agriculture and fisheries of the country remains a very important industry for socioeconomic stability, food security, and nutrition. It is therefore imperative that we continue to accelerate and scale transformation and provide necessary and relevant regulatory frameworks, not only on the rice sector, but the whole agriculture industry. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arnel. That was fantastic. And, thank you also for stepping in for the secretary. But we are happy to applaud the Laurel effect, as you said here. Thanks. I thought it was also really important, the reminder of how important it is in poor populations to ensure the stability of some of the key staple grains. So thank you also for that reminder, key entry point for issues related to diets there. Alvaro, over to you. We heard a lot about rural investment there, the investments in smallholder farmers. And so I'm wondering, given IFAD's exclusive focus that you have on rural development, how do you see this world unfold? I also, by the way, consider this a great success that we've had, without me saying nutrition, have had people talk about nutrition. So I'm going to hold you on that as well. But, really, what do you see unfolding here? How do you see the world in terms of, in this set of competing priorities, the kind of work that IFAD can do to strengthen rural investment for small-scale farming?
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for having us and for bringing this very important topic, which at this moment in time, I think it still needs to be put at the forefront, which is, I think, is one of the challenges. Poverty, hunger, malnutrition, it seems it has stepped back in terms of the priorities, and I think still should be the biggest priority or the biggest focus, and I think that's one of the challenges. Indeed, some of the panelists talked about food security as national security. We've heard heads of state talking about it, but the reality is that this has been the case here in the US, in the European Union for many, many decades. The reality when we talk now and we see trade talks talking about what are the red lines, you've seen a lot of politicians in Japan, the European Union saying agriculture is off the table. We haven't had a round of negotiation at the World Trade Organization for decades. So clearly agriculture is a very, very sensitive topic. And that's why why is it very sensitive? Because in many cases, it's the social fabric of a lot of our societies. In the case of Africa, it means 60, 70% of the jobs in many countries. And I think that's why it's especially important, the investments in small-scale farmers. It's not just about food, it's also about social returns, it's about the social fabric of many of them. When I have talked to a number of heads of state, especially after Ukraine, many of them started to think not only about production or productivity, but also about storage, distribution, transformation of raw materials in the countries. And it's very clear where the needs are coming, and many times the necessity, as we know, is the mother of invention. Every year you have 10 million young people coming to the job market in Africa, and most of the jobs currently are being still coming from the agriculture and rural development areas. So it's very clear that the need is there, and imagine the type of investment. Still they are importing, well, depends on the figures, and 60, 70 billion at least of US dollars every year in terms of food. I have been starting to discuss with the with the Agriculture Commissioner, the new Agriculture Commissioner of the African Union, and still I think there's a big opportunity for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We are not there, especially on agriculture, but why? Because it's also very sensitive, but I think there could be opportunities. And all the opportunities start, I think some colleagues in the World Bank mentioned, with obviously policy, the right policies, the right infrastructure. A lot of the MDBs are also seeing how they trickle down to the small-scale farmers. We're starting from IFAD also to co-finance, for example, with AIIB, with a lot of the, let's say, bigger dams. How do they really come to that small-scale farmers and to the smaller dams, and how irrigation and water, as an example, can come there? Because many of the investments just are at the bigger scale, but many of them do not trickle down. And that, to me, this is one of the cores of the aid, I would say, sector. A lot of people are dissatisfied. The inequality has increased, it's very clear, and I think this is at the core of a lot of the changes that we are seeing socially. Inequality is there, and a lot of people are not seeing what's the impact of these investments, and I think that's one of the key parts. Then we saw right now from the presentation from Philippines, the reality. The average age was 56 years old. This is not only in the developed world. So if we want to make a sector attractive, obviously it needs to come with technology, with a business case. If the income is not there, you will not attract any young people. Even if the income is there, you need to make it attractive. Many times that comes with technology, with a business case. And farming needs to be a business. We cannot continue thinking about farming, it's about subsistence farming. The key part is how do we actually bring it to small commercial scale. In that, some of it can come to us from public development banks as such, the focus, agriculture development banks, land banks. Many of them need to, and are being currently recapitalized, but it needs to come also from local private sector. We think that the big private sector, big international organizations are going to solve part of it. I don't think so. I mean, there we're talking perhaps about tens of thousands of jobs in the case of the bigger ones. But how do we actually trickle it to make sure that there's an ecosystem at the local private sector that is commercially viable? And I think that's where we all need to work. A lot of the investments, including from many of our organizations, go to the bigger picture, to the big trade finance, to the big, I would say, investment, but actually how are we supporting, catalyzing the local private sector? I think that's where the key resides, and we have to all rethink and focus on how can we trigger and catalyze not just the bigger agriculture trade, but also that small-scale local private sector. For us, that has meant in many cases evolving as a business model, now co-investing, using our balance sheet to co-invest with the local private sector. You mentioned bonds. We issued last year a nutrition bond, but that's just signals. I think the key part where the big money is in the local private sector, and that's where we all need to focus. How are our organizations, our governments supporting that? That comes with policy and infrastructure as they start, but then there's many more things that I think we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for very efficient remarks on a very wide range of topics. I think it's, there's quite a lot of work happening here at IFPRI as well on looking at revitalizing and the local private sector, including ag MSMEs and things like that. So we look forward to collaborating more on that. Gilles, let me welcome you on behalf of IFPRI. France has, of course, played a tremendous role in bringing the global nutrition community together. I think we should applaud, I think it was a $28 billion set of commitments that were made by funders and governments around the world. We'd like to hear from you what the next steps, what do the next steps look like? What does the World for Nutrition look like? What role do you think French and the Nutrition for Growth Summit might play? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank IFPRI and the World Bank for organizing that meeting, because it's also the starting point of the follow-up of the summit. And that will be also part of its success if we make sure that there is consequences after the summit. I will just not use my word, but use the word of Minister Steenhuisen. He said terrific. It's not France saying that. And you said tremendous. So, Okay, we take the compliment. No, but it was also a mobilization of plenty of stakeholders. And maybe allow me first to come back a little bit, to come back in time. 4 years ago, in 2021, right after the Olympics in Tokyo, it was the starting point of kind of outreach, sustained outreach from our Japanese partners, requesting us to, let's say, to take the next N4G summit. And I must confess that at that time, we were a bit hesitant. The minister since now has retired, so I can't tell it. It was quite a big challenge for let's say, the issue, which was not easy, nutrition, the logistics, because we are also quite worrying about the Olympics the same year. And we have not provided a prompt response to that. But after a few months of reflection, we said yes. We said we'll organize that. We make the mobilization. It will happen. I can remember because first we said we will organize that. After a couple of months, we said it will take place in France. And after a few months, we said it will take place in Paris. So we made it really step by step. And after that, we came to the conclusion that we needed a break between the Olympics, the Paralympics, and the summit. So that's why we organized it in March, 6 months after the Olympics, in order to be able to put all the energy we wanted to put in it to be fully ready. And after that, once the decision was made, let's say we did what we know, how we can do it, to put all the energy, all the mobilization of the French diplomatic network, to gather all the stakeholders in order to convince. First, we said it will be a moment of mobilization. It should not be a pledging conference. You mentioned, yeah. So that's definitely, it didn't happen. So, and in the end, I will come to the numbers. It was a huge moment of mobilization with 214 delegations, 106 at government level, and more than 400 commitments were taken during the summit. And the pledge, because in the end it was about pledging, it was like $28 billion. You said it. It's 24 euros, but it's bringing more added value to speak in dollars today. So the challenge now, the challenge is to keep the momentum, to make it happen. And for that, one concrete thing is to make sure that all the commitments and even more commitments could be registered in the summit's platform, in order to have them written down somewhere. Because if you want to ensure proper follow-up, you need to be able to track down the commitments. So that's truly one thing we will pay attention to. The platform should close by the end of June, and we will every day continue to reach out to make sure that all the commitments could be registered there. And after that, we need to keep the political momentum. That's what I said. So the next step, the very next steps, I see the Rome Nutrition Week that will take place by the end of May. FFD4 conference. We hope nutrition can be one part of the outcome. I know that there are many expectations for FFD4, but nutrition should be somewhere there. And the UNFS stocktake that should take place after the summer. That should be also another moment to keep the momentum. So we'll make sure that we put the same energy on it in order to make it happen. And that's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think in telling that story, it's clear how much effort it takes to keep temporal coherence as well. Keep this issue on people's agendas over time, not just across events and from global to local. One of the big areas of commitment, certainly at the Nutrition for Growth Summit, was on investments to support humanitarian assistance for nutrition. So it's a great moment to transition to you. Rania, in your role as Executive Director for Partnerships and Innovations for the World Food Program, this is obviously something you're keeping a close eye on, what's happening in terms of humanitarian assistance for food and for nutrition. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what that world looks like today. Where is it that we all need to keep our eyes on for that ball? It's a big, really a big topic of interest to people at IFPRI as well, a big part of our research agendas, but above all, it's a challenge for humanity. So let me give you my mic, because we know it works.
Thank you, Purnima. And I really must start by saying thank you to IFPRI and the World Bank for the first panel, because it set the context beautifully. And it was such a delight to listen to those on the panel here this morning as well. Before I even tell you on what the humanitarian context looks like and why we all need to work to reduce humanitarian needs, there is one other thing I wanted to add to what Maximo and everyone else said this morning, and that's conflicts. So today, there is 120 active conflicts in the world. That is the highest number since the Second World War. And that appends a lot of the areas that we work in and on. And that appends ending hunger and malnutrition in a very different way. But because I am a pragmatic optimist, I see opportunities even in conflict. And I'll come a little bit to that. We see the needs in hunger increase. You said that very well, Maximo. I think that's very clear. It's a clear, just a straight line increase, and especially in acute hunger. 340 million or so for us, acutely hungry. Do they know where their next meal is coming from? No. Do they know if they will have a meal? No, we don't know. And that number is on the rise. But you know what else is on the rise with it? Actually, ODA money until this year has been on the rise. There has been significant increase in official development assistance. It's just not coming to us. It's been redirected because of domestic priorities. It's been redirected for response within many of the high-income countries. So the result is a decline in what we get in the sector. But factually, the money is actually increasing, and there is a lot of money out there. And I think for the World Food Program, and we're the largest humanitarian agency in the world, we have a dual mandate that is little known. Our biggest muscle is our emergency response and responding to life-saving needs. But we also have a mandate to reduce humanitarian needs, and that's what we call our changing lives narrative. And why conversations like this are so critical, where we are invited as part of the solution. Every one of us today wants to reduce humanitarian needs. It's billions invested in that, when we could, with small shifts, also invest in high-risk contexts, fragile contexts, and shift the narrative and get to better results. I think in hunger and in nutrition. So how we have been shifting and diversifying our base to respond to that. I'll just note a few things we have witnessed in WFP. We have a very large donor base, no problem. 50% of that donor base over the last 5 years has shifted to become program countries. That's significant. 49 to 50 countries actually invest in their own social protection systems, in their own school meals, in their own growth, and they do it either through putting domestic resources to WFP and asking us to work with them, or they access loans, which they also request us to implement and support with them. But there is a rising awareness in many of the countries, and that is highly fragile context in many cases where we operate. They are increasingly conscious and aware that they have to reach that road, the eyes on the road, and to shift where they make their investments. And I think that is quite significant and a shift. Pakistan is on my top 10 donors, by the way, because they just took a massive multi-$100 million loan that they are investing in nutrition to top up their safety net. Benin, until recently, was also one of our top donors for school meals. So anchor the shift. I think things are happening. Michael's not here to see the optimism actually realistically grow despite the conflicts. But I think to the points raised earlier and now, there is a shift that is happening and we see it actively. I think our pivot to the private sector has been critical. We've always been able, because of our strong logistics arm and our ability to work in many fragile contexts, to reach global private partners, not just for resources, but also for their expertise on how we can have more efficient supply chain systems, how we can access smallholder farmers better, what efficiencies do we put in, what innovations and technologies do we use. And that's been quite critical for us. It has been about all the work you have been doing in de-risking and allowing many of them to come and operate with us. But we also invest in local private sector. I am from Sudan. Our largest local procurement in regional local procurement that we've done in the world in 2024 was in Sudan. Amidst a conflict, amidst a crisis, the largest in the world humanitarian crisis, we still had our largest local procurement done in Sudan for sorghum. For distribution in Sudan, but still a FET because the local private sector is active, significant, and is looking for opportunities. So I think we have been increasingly diversifying our engagement with the private sector. And then, oh my God, I've gone minus. I need to speak faster. I think our own collaborations have also shifted. To the work we do with IFAD and with FAO, we're collaborating better, to your points, on come to us coordinated, don't come fragmented, and we do the fragmented extremely well. We're getting better at learning to do the come together better. In the Sahel, we reclaimed 400,000 hectares of land from the desert, and in massive investment in land regeneration, done with all of you, many of you here. And that was done through AI, and that is not the AI you know, that is ancestral intelligence, using local ways of doing business. So anyway, a lot, and technology takes a big and central stage in this, certainly, in innovations, but I am optimistic despite a very difficult world today. I'm optimistic that we're able to respond and save lives, but to shift the narrative to reduce lives. Thank you.
Fantastic, Rania. Thank you so much. I think we needed the dose of optimism along with, what is a very real situation in front of us. Charlotte, can I have okay, good. She gives me a smile. This is, proof that this has been a very inspiring panel. So let's take a couple of questions, please. Do you mind going to the mic, if it works? Any other hands in the room? Okay. I guess I have to do what Yo did earlier. Walk the mic over. Okay.
I think we're going to need yours.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Ayodele Balogun, AFEX. And I must start from Rania's great point. I think World Food Program definitely starting almost a decade ago with Purchase for Prosperity and a lot of the efforts. AFEX is a partner in Nigeria and in Kenya, supply chain partner, and we work with WFP on sorghum, connecting farmers to that market. So, and that brings me to the point on how are we thinking around innovation, more innovation and less sort of bureaucracy in terms of how we work in with the private sector, and particularly from an African perspective. African SMEs are small to mid-scale. What innovation can we do that we can, help grow that capacity and use those as anchor channels to drive and reach the smallholder farmers, because the challenge is around fragmentation and the cost of reaching them. So what efforts? I also want to, IFAD about 5 years ago started with a big leap. Thanks, the work that you've done around private sector and providing a financing mechanism. But this is, even very small to be called a pilot. So, what's the next 5 years looking like in terms of how to provide catalytic capital to be able to unlock capital markets on the continent, provide de-risking mechanisms, and work stronger with private sector to drive this change.
Great, thank you. That's a complex question. Let me see if there are any more questions in the room. No? Okay. All right. Well, let me throw a question to all of you then. Our role at IFPRI is to do the research that hopefully helps inform some of the big decisions that all of you are making. So maybe if you could, share with us a little bit, where do you think the big knowledge needs are? What is it that we can do to, help support this agenda and help keep eyes on the road? Okay, so 2 questions, one for all of you and whoever would like to take that question. I think you can take that one.
Yeah, I'll take the first one. Thank you. So probably, as you mentioned, I think the biggest challenge, and we all talk about it, is scale and fragmentation, because the reality is that when we talk about small-scale farmers, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. When you talk to a big of the corporations, and I talk to them, how can we support on the value chains, or they're talking about, in the best of the cases, tens of thousands. So I think that scale and fragmentation is very clear. When we talk about capital markets being there to invest in small-scale farmers, I don't think that's a reality. When I talk to Middle East sovereign wealth funds, they are going into Africa, they're buying land, they're buying big agribusinesses, but they're not investing in small-scale farmers. So the extent of the challenge is very different, and we have to understand that it's, as some of you have said, complex, and it's really very difficult. There's not going to be one size fits all. So for us, that means, in our case, our competitive advantage is we have currently 9 billion of sovereign loans and public sector programs. How can we embed into those also private sector entry points, and also how they can take over when we finalize? I think the current model of just coming in with a project on ourselves and so on does not work. It's very clear. We need platforms, we need the scale, and part of it is also thinking ahead of time, how can the private sector take over, what's the sustainability, where can they enter right now, and we all have to change our mindsets, and I think that's where it's coming from. The same goes with public development banks. Many of them, well, in Africa, they're not very big, but there are still a lot of them, and with some of the heads of state, we're thinking also on how can they also support better agriculture, and how can they also support better financing of rural areas. We need that scale, and we need the flows. For that, we need many of the actors. These are some, but also many of our institutions need to change the mindset of how we program and how we come together.
And any comments on what research or what evidence can we generate to help you walk that road better?
I'll let the panelists.
All right, great. So let me bring you in, John. I see you have your hands up as well. So let me bring you in on that, and then maybe a couple minutes to each of you to close out.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And I think the question is a really good one. And it's how we harness the private sector in partnership to be able to ensure that they are playing a meaningful role. And one of those things is through value chain inclusion. And through our agriculture and agro-processing master plan in South Africa, we've adopted a value chain roundtable approach where we bring all the players within a value chain together to discuss how we can include more smallholder farmers. Just 2 weeks ago, we launched a project in northern KwaZulu-Natal, which was, I think, a very good example of the public-private partnership. We had provided some land as part of a land reform program to smallholder farmers, but the partnership was with Unilever, who then guaranteed the uptake for the chilies and other herbs and spices that the small-scale producers were producing. And so it did a number of things. First of all, it ensured that we have a viable, sustainable, and profitable operation that the department can then walk on to the next project, and that will remain sustainable. Unilever benefits because they now have access to well-priced local spices and chili plants and the products thereof. And of course, the farmers benefited. And Unilever put them on an extensive course on quality and the type of management of the crop that they require to meet their standards. And so I think it's a perfect example of how the public government and private can play a big role in bringing smallholder farmers into the value chain. It's also important that we use methods to aggregate smallholder farmers so that they can reach the quantities and quality that is required by the value chain. And it's only through that roundtable approach, by sitting with the value chain, that I think you can determine what the needs are, but then also what the opportunities are. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Minister Steenhuisen. Fantastic. Any other comments?
Yeah, on your last point, Purnima, I just focus on the Philippine experience again. I guess on our side, we really need to focus on addressing the gaps and inefficiencies in the Philippines. Especially, for example, we have 1 million hectares of potentially irrigable areas, and our post-harvest losses is so huge, twice that of Vietnam. Vietnam has 8% post-harvest losses, while we are in the Philippines, we have about 18 up to 20% losses. So by addressing these gaps and inefficiencies, we can reduce our dependence on imports. So we are happy to have partnered with the World Bank in several projects now in transforming some of the key policy changes and reform agendas in the Philippines. So I guess these are the key innovations that we need to do as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Two things I think you can do that would be, brilliant. Keep having conversations like this because it keeps the political advocacy on hunger and malnutrition alive. The G20, the G7, everyone has to make sure at a time like this that this tops the agenda. We often say a hungry person has 3 options. They revolt, so more insecurity and civil disturbance. They move, migration, displacement, etc., or they starve. There are not many options. And so keeping the political advocacy on this is really quite critical. And then the second is through the evidence, maybe the reassurance to the private sector, to the IFIs, to the regional banks, that we do need a much more diverse set of financial tools for all of us to invest in this and to link us better. We commit to our own linkages and improvements, but I do think that we need others to be also convinced that this is where the major investment in the world should happen.
Thank you. No. All right. Well, I will take this panel to a close then. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I leave both inspired and moved about the need for us to collectively focus on, topics of food security, hunger, and malnutrition, of course. But also what each of you brought, I think, was a great reminder that each of us carries the ability to work from where we are, to keep eyes on the road and to take things forward, whether it's, hosting global meetings, doing effective research, thinking about financing models, bringing communities together to make commitments, and solving some really big domestic challenges that have regional and global effects. So thank you all so much. We look forward to keeping our eyes on the road together. Over to the next panel.
Where are you going? This is the third panel is on the private sector. It's been touched upon throughout the first 2 panels, so we're about to do a deep dive into the role that value chains can play. So in this session, we're looking at knowledge and evidence on how well-functioning value chains can contribute to the agenda we've been talking about. How do we harness market expertise, efficiencies, and innovations to help value chains do this? Because current agri-food investments are failing to catch up with rising demand for food and nutritious food. So particularly in the face of shifting diets and population growth and intensifying climate impacts, how will these investments be scaled as they need to be? The world cannot feed itself sustainably if smallholder farmers and small and medium enterprises, which produce most of our food, are not effectively connected to the value chains. If they struggle to participate in the value chain, we're going to have a problem. The World Bank and its partners, actually many of its partners, have invested in approaches that focus exactly on linking smallholders to market, approaches like productive alliances, where the object is to organize production and producers to reach markets. And we have seen and measured real increases in net revenue and in food security for farmer households that participate in productive alliances or participate in the markets. And so that's why we're going to take a look in this last segment into like a deep dive on the role of value chains in boosting food and nutritional security. And I have an amazing panel to help us do that. And as I introduce them, if they can come up, I'd like to start with introducing you to Alice Ruhweza, who is the president of AGRA. Welcome, Alice. Prior to joining AGRA as their president, Alice has been Africa's regional director for the World Wildlife Fund since 2019. She contributed significantly in her various roles also at Conservation International before that. So kind of a laser focus on sustainability. It's long-standing. She also played a pivotal role at the UNDP, where she led the Global Environment Finance Unit in Africa, mobilizing over $600 million to support environmental initiatives. So welcome, Alice, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to move on to introducing Ayodeji Balogun, who has already been at the mic today as Group Chief Executive Officer of AFEX. Ayo leads global teams of experts who leverage technology, innovative finance, and inclusive agriculture to do exactly what I was speaking about just 2 minutes ago, to connect agri-SMEs and smallholder farmers to commodity and financial markets. So thank you so much for joining us, Ayo. I'd like to invite, sure, why not? I'd like to also invite Matthias Berninger. He is Executive Vice President, Head of Public Affairs, Sustainability, and Safety at Bayer Global. Welcome, Matthias. Matthias has been with Bayer since 2019, where he first joined as Senior Vice President for Public Affairs, Science, and Sustainability. He now leads Bayer's global public affairs practice, among other things, leading the development of a coherent global sustainability strategy for Bayer, and also supporting the organization to follow through on those things. And just an interesting point about Matthias, he was also elected 4 times as a member of the German Federal Parliament, representing the Green Party. And he was even appointed vice minister. He's looking at me because I'm not supposed to mention that, for the Federal Minister of Consumer Protection. Finally, online, we have our colleague, Joseph Glauber. Joe is Research Fellow Emeritus here at IFPRI. He spent over 30 years at the USDA, serving as Chief Economist and as Chief Agricultural Negotiator at the Doha WTO talks. Joe has led critical research on trade insurance, disaster policy, and U.S. foreign policy, and we're delighted that he is joining us virtually. So why don't we get started? So I think we're going to dive. The idea is that we're going to dive immediately into sort of practical, tangible elements of this challenge around the private sector and also the potential. And I wanted to start with you, Alice, on agricultural transport corridors. It's very specific, but it's also very important. And I was wondering if you could just take us through that importance, why they're so essential for African and global food systems, how they've progressed, and maybe what the role AGRA has in supporting them as well. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much also to IFPRI and the World Bank for inviting me. So I think the good thing about being in a third panel is that a lot of the points have been made. But 3 things that I am also going to focus on. One is that Africa must act, and I agree. Everybody has said we must act, and we must act. We have to reduce food imports. We have to reduce malnutrition. The other one, I think, for me, is that we have solutions. We have solutions. Some people talked about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, all of these. We have solutions. And one of those solutions is what I'm going to talk about today, which we call the Africa Food Baskets. But it's very much within our corridor approach that you're asking about. So the Africa Food Baskets, and what is that about? This is how we work in corridors when you're asking about that. So it is about identifying areas with the strongest potential to supply additional food to the continent. We call them the food production basins. The second one is then identifying the corridors that could link these production basins to areas of need in the region, and we call them the demand sinks. And then the last one is then identifying the catalytic investments that are required to unlock the potential of these basins and corridors. And why is this important? Because, Africa already has this continental free trade area. We have regional economic communities. We already have corridors that exist, Lobito and others, that there's already investments there happening, infrastructure and others. So really it's about how do we then make food move from where it's produced to really where it's needed. And you concentrate interventions in the geographic areas that have the highest potential, looking beyond country borders to build regionally integrated markets, leveraging existing and planned infrastructure that is there. Creation of an attractive investment climate is important, getting the private sector in there, and of course harnessing the political imperative to inclusive economic growth. We talked about the social contract and jobs for youth. Now I want to give you the examples. So one of the example here is, by the way, as a starting point, we've looked at 8 food production basins with potential to become regional supply sheds. So Nigeria and Zambia, for example, stand out as potential production basins for rice and wheat, respectively, given their agroecological conditions and current production. They are well connected to the Abidjan-Lagos corridor and Lobito corridor, respectively. But then we also have the regional economic communities providing the political and enabling environment. Of course, we recognize that there are some system challenges that we need to address: export prices, barriers to trade, investments. But all of that we know can happen because we already have that infrastructure there. So we are focusing on looking at infrastructure, improving availability and quality of infrastructure, working with partners, electricity, irrigation, logistics, road, rail, and ports. And this is where really the private sector also could come in. Enforcing consistent trade and competition policies. This is the enabling environment, the harmonizing of trade policies, standards, working with partners like Trademark, Africa, and others, and lowering, of course, the cost of capital. This is extremely important. So AGRA, really for us, it's about partnering, policy predictability, especially bringing in a really connecting, being the connector, the honest broker in this space. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Alice, because, oh, sure, yes. Because Matthias, I'm just wondering, being from Bayer and hearing Alice speaking about sort of all these enabling conditions, et cetera, how does Bayer's crop science division view investment opportunities in Africa? And I'm asking because, Bayer is invested in this new seed processing facility in Zambia. And I was wondering if you could speak to what prompted you, out of all the kind of sort of enabling conditions that Alice articulated, what prompted you to specifically invest in that facility in Zambia? And then perhaps even more generally speaking to us about the objectives around making seed available in the sub-region, but also how you partner in order to strengthen rural communities through that process. Matthias.
Yeah, so first of all, we do business with more than 50 million smallholder farmers. Our goal is by 2030 to work with 100 million. So we have a pretty aggressive strategy of investing in smallholder farming communities. We also believe it's good business. So I think that's also good news. Why did we focus on Zambia? So partially, Alice already has talked about it. It's one of those hidden giants in driving agriculture productivity in Africa. Another reason is, I don't know whether you know that organization, USAID, who has been very active in that space. They have a program that we dearly miss, which is Feed the Future. So that helped to orchestrate that investment. Also the World Bank, for example, in the irrigation space was very active there. We have seen with the drought of last year how important irrigation is as one of the key enablers in this space. And then last but not least, there is such a huge demand, so every bag of seed we are producing will be sold. Now that sounds like a good business opportunity. So when you know that people will buy your products because they are so desperately needed, then that's good news. One of the key challenges, of course, is when we do seed production, we can't do it in every country. So how do we ensure that these corridors work? So in case, for example, of a food shortage, that seed suddenly isn't purposed like through national interest. So seed is one of those very important tradable elements of revolutionizing food supply in Africa. And one of the investments in seed production
roughly feeds 30 million additional people. So if you think about it, once you create the seed value chain, you really move into an engine that can solve for quite a significant part of the calorie shortage. But I want to say the most important investment is not the seed. We believe, and it hasn't been talked about today, the most important investment is actually insurance. Smallholder farmers in Africa, unlike all the other farmers we talk about, do not have insurance. And we work with one insurer that reaches at the moment more than 10 million smallholder farmers. We need to reach, our goal is that every of our customer has an insurance, because these people invest their livelihoods in a harvest that may or may not come. So we need to ensure that. And interestingly, Pula is the investor also working dearly with you. We talked about it earlier. So let's talk about these kind of innovations. They are crucially important. So insurance is one of the ones that we haven't talked about enough in the recent debates about food insecurity.
Yeah, and I'm just hearing you speak and thinking about, Alice, what you were saying as well. There's just a lot about connecting the dots, that individual elements, profitable business model, basins of productivity, et cetera, and it's how they all sort of connect. And IO, I mean, that's really the bread and butter, right, of AFEX. And I'm wondering if you could maybe first put us all on the same page as to what AFEX is and what problem it was set up to solve in Nigeria. But more generally, just talk us through the role of commodity markets in strengthening agri-food value chains, what we're speaking of right now, because despite its wealth in ag resources, somehow commodity markets on the continent remain underdeveloped. So any insights?
No, sure, absolutely. So, the first question that and I want to pose it to all of us here to just think about for a moment. If you wanted to be a part owner of a Fortune 100 tech company, how do you do that? Stock markets, right? So bring that to a smallholder farmer in Kaduna State in Nigeria, and he wants to supply into a large order from Unilever. How does it do that? A commodities exchange. So what it does is it creates that mechanism that disaggregates that large order and that large economic activity, provides the infrastructure to ensure that you, in your own farmer, in your own corner, can take 10 bags of maize into a warehouse, and that fills part of a 100,000 order over 3 months, placed by a big buyer, right? When you take out that market mechanism, systems don't work. If you take out the stock exchange from any country, people can't be part of large corporates. When you take out commodities exchange out of the African food systems, then the farmers stay small perpetually. They can't have that upside, and they cannot invest in the infrastructure required that for them to really grow capital and wealth. So that's a conundrum. Before the continent had the marketing boards, in the mid-80s, almost all the marketing boards, save for a few, were abolished because it wasn't efficient. But there's been no solution for as old as I am for the decades. And yields on the continent for cereals have stayed at the same level for that 40 years. It takes bold investments like Bayer to come in with that big capital. But even if you look at the Southern African markets, the reason why you have that level of base, an addressable market, is part of the work of the South Africa Futures Exchange over the last 22 years in organizing that market. And you've seen that flow into Zambia, into Zimbabwe, and a few other markets around there. But if you go to West Africa, you go to East Africa, since the, if you look at when the marketing boards were abolished or have not overfunctioned, the systems have remained small, farmers have remained very fragmented, and you wouldn't be able to create this value. So that work of aggregation is the first part of what a commodities exchange does, and it helps organize. The second part is, when you look at policy, Unfortunately, on the continent, most of our policymakers make policy on the basis of journalists and news article. And at that time, it's too late, right? The event has happened, there are protests on the streets, and then they're like, okay, call the best brains in the mind to meet tomorrow morning, and then we have to make a reaction. You're 1 year late in agriculture because 6 months planting cycle, 3 months supply chain, pre and post, so that reaction is sort of delayed. But what an exchange does, and the capacity for you to be able to predict and see prices 3 months, 6 months, 9 months ahead, allows you to understand where things are going, and it gives you that lead time to start acting versus acting when it's too late to intervene. I think the last part of it is capital at risk, right? So how do you bring in the guy with capital, the guy that wants to buy the final products, and the guy producing it together in one room, such that you can give him money today against when he needs it, right? And then when he needs it, there's a buyer that is buying the commodity that pays, and that money flows back to the investor plus his return. And that is fundamentally the role of a commodities exchange. Lastly, if you look at, most of, coincidentally, particularly for Africa, most of the poor farmers that are also part of the numbers that we have to get into food security are also the same people that produce the food we eat. It's a conundrum. They are the producers of 70 to 80% of the food that we eat, but they are also the same people that fall into that poverty trap 4 months, 6 months down the line when you're in the lean season and prices go up by 50 to 60%. And part of that is that you don't have that mechanism that can help them delay when they sell. You don't have warehouse receipt systems, you don't have storage, you don't have things that allow them delay income and spread it over the same year. So everybody plants at the same time, everybody sells at the same time, everybody goes broke at the same time. So when we create this market mechanism, we start to, and that's the same thing, with us, right? We can delay our income and distribute it over our 70 to 80 year lifespan, by investing in stocks, by investing. So that market mechanism for him every season, it needs something that allows him to be able to earn over 12 months as opposed to just once.
So you're a very good advocate for commodity markets. So I have questions, but it's not about me. We're going to go straight to Joe and then open up for question and answer. But thank you very much for that, Io, because it's exactly what we're speaking about how those connections are made and how those producers are integrated. And there are kind of three different models that the three of you have brought forward, all of them, which depending on markets and private sector engagement. And so I also found the policy comments that you've all made interesting, and maybe we could carry that into the Q&A as well. But I would like to now invite Joe, given your deep expertise across all aspects of this issue, it would be great if you could zoom out and share your perspective about how Africa can elevate its role in the global economy, especially by tapping into future opportunities for trade and regional integration and value addition. We've been talking about food and nutrition security all morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. What's needed to tap into these opportunities in terms of regional and international trade rules, environments, etc. I see you're up on the screen. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And first, so sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I have a hard stop, unfortunately, at 12 for another appointment. But I'd like to first just reiterate sort of the role of trade facilitation that these other panelists have been so articulate with, because I think before you can really talk about, opening markets and everything, you really need to improve competitiveness so that you can compete in global markets and regional markets. And that means addressing transportation concerns, reducing transit times, not just at the port, but also getting food from interior producing areas to the places where they're being sold. Improvements in infrastructure like refrigeration, processing, storage, warehousing, all these things that again, the other panelists addressed very, very well. I think, in terms of overall trade integration, that's been lagging. And I think it was alluded to in the earlier panel on, progress in the WTO. Frankly, on market access, very little progress has been made since, frankly, the Uruguay round. I mean, we've had some work on trade facilitation, which is very important. But I think in terms of actually increasing market access and making any sort of serious effort and getting rid of trade distorting domestic support, that certainly is we've made very little progress. And I spent a couple of years as a negotiator during the Doha round, and unfortunately we weren't able to come away with anything at that point. I would say the same thing with obviously with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's moving on a slower pace, but again, I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of getting improving sort of the trade facilitation work as well. The rest of the world, there is a lot of negotiations on free trade agreements. Unfortunately, Africa is largely excluded from that, and I think that's a real shame. And in fact, I think it hurts when you talk about trying to negotiate market access within the WTO, because so many of the countries now are looking for getting those gains outside of the WTO, and I think that complicates, as a former negotiator, that certainly complicates the negotiations. And then we have, again, sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of trade moves, external trade moves through preferential trade agreements, and obviously a lot goes to the EU, a little bit to the US through the American Growth and Opportunity Act, or African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. AGOA is up for reauthorization. Again, that factors into this overall bigger storm cloud that we're now dealing with in terms of trade policy, particularly trade policy in the US, and the sort of unilateralism we've seen over the last few months. Which could potentially have direct effects. We've a group of us have been writing some stuff for IFPRI on this, looking at the direct impacts on tariffs and how that could help or hurt exporters trying to get grain and or other agricultural products into the U.S., but also the indirect impacts, and that is particularly if these sorts of actions result in trade wars. The old African adage, when the elephants dance, it's the ants that gets trampled. And unfortunately, there are, potentially some very big trade diversions that could have impacts for countries. So I think it's something that obviously everyone is very much has a reason to be concerned about. There's a lot of uncertainty in that, which is making things difficult as well. But hopefully we will see progress and see more movement towards trade integration, but we need to get back on that track. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Okay, you heard the man. We're taking questions. Why we can go. If you're in the room, please come up to the mic. There is a button. It does work. It just takes patience. And please identify yourself, which I failed to do at the beginning, and pose your question.
There we go. Good. Thank you so much. I'm Russ Webster from Food Enterprise Solutions. I wanted to start by thanking the panelists and the comments about capital markets, commodity exchange, trade integration. Matthias, your comments about insurance. And I wanted to just express my own view that oftentimes when we're talking about food security and food systems development programming, we oftentimes overlook the importance of capital markets and also the importance of infrastructure. And there are various funds that are being developed for Africa to promote bonds and so on for infrastructure. And I wanted to ask the panel if you have some examples of success, recent successes, or maybe some glimmers of hope or some good examples of mobilizing capital for infrastructure, because at the end of the day, food systems are going to be about markets. Getting nutrition to consumers is about market access and energy and roads and all of those things that are important to really help spur some industrialization of the ag sector in Africa. So my question is, can you give us some examples of where you see good efforts in this arena, but also can you give us your views about where the challenges and where the gaps still remain in capital markets and mobilization for infrastructure for agriculture? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And let's take a second question and then we'll turn to the panel. You have to hit the button, yeah. It's on the bottom.
Apologies. Once and done. Okay, how's that? Rob Bertram, USAID, and I'm not sure I'm supposed to be speaking, but I'm going to do it anyway. As a private sort of citizen who's been a long time observer. No, thank you. So Shobha reminded us this morning that it was about agricultural growth. That's where we're going to get our poverty reduction. That's where we're going to get a big part of our malnutrition reduction. But it's really this panel that's drilled down into that. And I just want to share a couple of things. One is this issue of productivity. And Alice, you really really nailed it. That's why you got a round of applause when you started. But I wanted to then link to Matthias's comments. You know, Alice, you talked about the production and then getting it to markets, and then the policy beyond that. So the hybrid maize that you do, Matthias, that's the tip of the spear. Because what happens with hybrid maize is that if farmers use good agronomy and some fertilizer, they get 3 or 4 times the yield. So it changes the way people think about seeds, but also about soil health. So I wanted to not lose sight of that. All the other discussions have been great, and the context is fine. But the competitiveness that Joe mentioned is that ultimately goes back to that productivity. And we still have a situation where Africa is lagging the rest of the world in primary productivities. So I just wanted to not lose sight of that. And then Matthias, just one other thing, you know, we have tried at USAID for decades, literally, on crop insurance. And it's not easy. It basically needs to be subsidized. And so this is the challenge. And what I would say is, we're always looking for creative thinking. And there's people like Michael Carter at UC Davis and Chris Barrett at Cornell who have really good insights and could share them. But we're always looking to get the impact. And what we've seen is we now have 20 million acres of drought-tolerant hybrid maize in Eastern and Southern Africa with 10 million farm families. And that's because of the things that Alice was talking about, and the partnerships that Bayer was in, the CGIAR was in, AGRA was in, others were in, and so I want to just shine a light on that fundamental. So as much as I'm sympathetic to trying to push the innovation down the income and risk scale, but we're also making great gains every year. That number is going up like 10% a year, the land coverage. And I loved your point about that you're going to sell all your seed. That's a fantastic signal. So the demand is there, the interest in innovation is there. Anyway, sorry for the just sort of exposition, but I really appreciate all of what you said. So thank you very much for sort of reminding us that the basics underpin all the rest of the food system and the trade. Thanks.
No, I think that's a great point. And Matthias, we were speaking just before the event about that productivity gap. Did you want to start with that, and then we will move down?
Many of us have been talking to smallholder farmers, so I think all of us have these stories one way or the other. So when you talk to a smallholder farmer, more likely a woman than a man, and you talk about the productivity increase and what they do with it, so the shift from self-sufficiency and a bit of local trade to actually getting cash and actually being able to trade and buy something and sell something, is transformative for those communities. And that's the experience we make in the area of corn seeds, but you can also go to cassava, you can go to tomatoes, You can go to wheat. So wherever you go, you see huge improvements. And I think the key question then, and that is why I'm so adamant about crop insurance, the key question then is, how do you make sure that those cash investments are not bets that basically bet literally your whole income, your whole farm on an uncertain future, which we all know with climate change is going to be more uncertain than it was before. That's the key question we need to resolve. How do we get food insurance or crop insurance done for smallholders? I think the answer is everybody has to chip in. So we as a company have to chip in because we want those farmers to buy inputs from us. Reinsurers have to chip in because it offers a great opportunity for a new business. Those who talk about climate adaptation and money for climate adaptation and wanted to go to farms have a great opportunity to chip in. So when you do that, and that's what we have experienced, it's not that much money per stakeholder to chip in, but the effects are really great. Since we talk about insurance, I want to leave you with one last thought. We will not be able to close the gap that a lack of boot on the ground will leave. So the biggest insurance for our projects is not IFC giving us some sort of help or even MEGA jumping in with some sort of help. The biggest insurance is that there are people on the ground who have actually expertise, who can help us to find the right places to invest. And also to the other question, to ensure that the roads and bridges are where the investments are and not in a totally different part of a country if two stakeholders or five agree to go in the same country. So the orchestration. So how do you orchestrate without somebody who is doing the orchestration is a big, big question, which is why I believe that the fact that an institution like GIZ has actually been strengthened by the now incoming government is an important step in the right direction. We need to think about how do we keep the people that have this expertise employed, and it's partially a private sector investment, partially an investment of others. I also have to apologize because I will have to leave a bit earlier to go actually in the building you know very well, and I'm told there are lines this week, so I have to be there on time.
Everybody's lining up to get into the bank. That's right. Now, Alice, you're clutching that mic. Is it about productivity? And could you share a good example that our first question asker was asking about in terms of a good example of mobilizing capital for infrastructure? Either one of those or both, up to you.
I will tackle the productivity, and I know that my colleague here will tackle the infrastructure and everything. Thank you, Rob, very much for reminding me again why Agra started 20 years ago, actually. It was really about productivity. It was about how do we support smallholder farmers to produce more? Because if they produce more, they can feed their families, and they can have some left that they can actually sell in the market, and they can get an income, and they can pay for their children's education, school fees, and go to hospital. And after 20 years of doing that, we are starting to get to that number, 3.5 metric tons per hectare. If you can do that, you can start to get those numbers. So that's very important. But another thing that our work with seeds, with really supporting the local seed ecosystem and really growing it. And we're seeing amazing examples. In Tanzania, we have a company called Meru Agro. I mean, it's providing the seed that is needed almost for that entire country. And of course, they need more. The partnerships with the CGIAR, of course, the breeding that you do, the climate-resistant varieties, all of that, being able to get to that. I think that we've had some good strides over 20 years. So it is about productivity. It is, because if you produce, you can feed, and then you can have some. Of course, developing the market and trade, and we do work on trade, that's important. It's not just the local markets that are important, but it's also how you're linked to the regional. And that's why that food baskets becomes the ones I presented earlier, the corridors that exist become important. And I think Africa, even though Africa is left out of the markets, as you said, Africa needs to trade with itself. That's why we did the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The potential is very high. We are lagging, but we can do better. We can definitely do better. And the work we do on policy and state capability is also extremely important, because without the right policy environment, we're not able to really drive the local seed, the seed policies, the trade policies, and all all those links. And on infrastructure, which I'm handing over to him, I think the PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, I think is a good example where we're really driving some investments, but please, you say more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, one of the things we've seen in the capital markets, I'll use an FX example. 2019, one of the big challenges we saw was unlocking capital, both for us, but for buyers on our platform, the feed mills, the food processing companies. So we looked at several instruments. The banks weren't bulging, natural, the perceived risk. So we came to this innovative product called the asset-backed commercial papers. So bigger corporates could go to the capital market to raise commercial papers. 360 days to 70 days covers their production cycle. But the mid-tier companies didn't have the credit rating to be able to access this product. So we went to our capital market regulators and we started the mortgage-backed security kind structure and said, look, if we have commodities in a warehouse, you have the warehouse receipt system, it is priced, the location, it's a fungible, tradable instrument. Why don't we roll up this warehouse receipts and back it up with the corporate as a secondary guarantee? And then with that, a B+ rated company can become an A- rated company. And then we use that, and we've used that to raise over $250 million in the last 3-4 years in repeated cycles from the capital markets. So, you just see that situation where bags of grains supplied by farmers in a warehouse then become part of the collateralization and securitization of a corporate going to raise money in the market. And that sort of helped us grow very tremendously. On micro, one of the stories that I must, also share is that, when we were also growing, and it was on the back of the growth of the demand. So we got capital into the exchange. Buyers wanted to buy more volume. We grew the number of farmers from 550,000 that we're working with to close to 500,000 farmers that are working and selling through the FX platform today. We also then went to Agra to say, look, we need to expand our own infrastructure. We also need to improve our outreach model. What's the cost of reaching the farmer? At the time, it was, we're earning 60 cents for every dollar spent. And we knew that bringing technology and bringing a bit more digital services closer to the farmer will flip that around. And then we got a grant from Agra. It was about $1.5 million. And we went back to our investors and said, we need $3 million more from you to come and combine this. And because we had $1.5 million, they couldn't say no. And with this, we brought that investment that allowed us to scale through this journey from 50,000 farmers to 500,000 farmers in 4 or 5 years, from one country to four countries in the same time period. So it's that power of how can you leverage, combine forces, combine the power of the demand and the buyer, combine capital providers that are commercial first, but also have the development partners take bold stance and say, look, I'll take the bottom, piece of this risk profile and allow everybody else come in blended financing structures. We've seen some also work in the sukuk market, where you're raising sukuk bonds, which are, Islamic-based bonds tied to projects and paid back by the states. And these, has done farm roads and some irrigation works in some countries. So these are some of the models, but not at the scale that we need to solve the global food systems or the African food systems.
Perhaps not, but, and I suspect you probably have more models that you wanted to talk about, so I hope you will in the reception that follows. I wanted to take one quick minute to maybe ask Joe to close out the session. And Joe, I have a question about elephants and ants. So you were saying, trade diversion, it's challenging, and but if you've ever been to a picnic where you think you got the ant, but it's like climbing up your arm 2 minutes later. So don't you think that trade diversion might also be an opportunity for Africa?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, goes without saying. And I think even you'll see that in some of the reports that we've published thus far, that some of the countries actually, can potentially gain from that. The near term, there's just so much froth and uncertainty, I think, that is the damaging aspect. But absolutely, I mean, if this will, anytime there are trade opportunities, markets will react, and that may mean that countries, say in Latin America, could be shipping a lot more fruits and vegetables to the U.S. or in the event of a trade war, or African countries similarly. That again, a lot depends on how much trade currently is going on with those countries. The U.S. doesn't do much trade with sub-Saharan Africa, despite AGOA and other things like that. But these trade wars do have those sorts of impacts, and there are opportunities, absolutely.
Okay, so now we know what to do. I want to just have you join me in thanking our panelists for a really great conversation.
Let's have a big round of applause for this panel, as well as the two previous panels. And a warm thank you to the excellent moderators that we had for these last three sessions, Ruth, Purnima, and Lorraine. Thank you so much. And while I'm thanking people, a big thanks to IFPRI's event management team for putting on this event. And again, a thank you to the World Bank for the collaboration. It's now my pleasure to ask our closing speaker to try to make some sense of these three panels and give us a little bit of an optimistic feeling as we leave and mingle after Martin's presentation over lunch. So Martin, I think, doesn't need much introduction. He's with the Gates Foundation in charge of the program on agricultural development. So we're excited to have you here and look forward to your closing remarks.
Well, very good. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And actually very pleased to be here, to be back after I left about a year ago to join the foundation. And thanks for the opportunity to provide some closing remarks. I think it has been a great event with many great insights and perspectives. There was the question whether we are entering new territory, and I think that's clearly the case. I think Joe said it as well. I mean, the significant drop in development assistance and then the rebooting of the global trading systems that we see unfolding as we speak, I think leads us to the conclusion at the foundation that we're moving into new territory. At the same time, also, we're moving into the new territory when there's growing consensus that the 1.5 degree target and the 2020 climate finance target are also unlikely to be reached. So we're really in a kind of a difficult situation. And of course, these developments, in fact, increase the risk of rising hunger and rising malnutrition. So there's even greater need, I mean, to keep our eyes on the road, as it said here, to end hunger and to end malnutrition. So in light of these developments, I mean, the foundation has adopted a defend and diversify approach. And I thought it would be interesting actually to share that with you because it touches upon a lot of points that were discussed here this morning. And underpinning this approach of defend and diversify is our belief that, and I think it was mentioned by a few speakers as well, including from the World Food Programme, that in challenge there's opportunity, and at times of change, I mean, can be times of renewal. I think Joe was also speaking about it, and also Maximo. So when it comes to defend ODA then, I mean, the foundation is particularly focused on defending health and agriculture because those are the two big priorities for the foundation. For agriculture, we see very good opportunities to link this with growing concerns about national defense and security. And actually, Michael was talking about it, putting forward the notion that there is no security without food security. And in that respect, we're also very pleased, actually, that there's a work stream on food security in the Munich Security Conference. And we are looking at the foundation into ways and means to support this. I think the World Bank is also part of that food security work stream. The foundation actually already provided a grant to the Center for Climate and Security at the Council on Strategic Risks that actually resulted in a report last year on feeding the resilience plan, safeguarding U.S. national security at the crossroads of food and climate change. So the foundation has been engaging on that, and we're looking forward also to kind of further engage on that with the Munich Security Conference. Actually, I was at the Munich Security Conference a few months back, my first time, and I found it very interesting to see that with the military is increasingly focusing on the notion for effective defense on the concept of the notion of hybrid warfare, and food as a weapon of war actually is increasingly being acknowledged by the military as a critical part of this notion of hybrid warfare. So in that respect, I mean, the notion of national agriculture, food systems and farmers as being part of the country's wider defense systems, I mean, we think at the foundation could potentially provide a very powerful advocacy argument, I mean, to make the case for adequate public funding, I mean, to agriculture and food. Now, that's on the defense side. On the diversified part of the foundation approach, we see good opportunities, and I would like to mention 5 of them. So we have quite a few opportunities here. And of course, you know, and a few have been mentioned already in the debate this morning. But first of all, you know, if we are in new territory, I mean, then you can clearly assume that the political economy has shifted as well. What was not possible previously in view of political economy considerations might actually be possible now. We've always been saying, you know, money is not a problem. Actually, it's political will, and political economy has shifted. So in that respect, we at the Foundation are very hopeful that the time to detox development, a World Bank report a few years back, has now come, and that we can now move forward on the implementation of repurposing environmentally harmful subsidies. And doing so, we all know that is a double win. We get rid of the harmful effects of the current subsidies, and we use those as resources, as drivers of good outcomes. And of course, we talk big numbers that we mentioned here, north of $600 billion per year for agriculture alone, and those are just the explicit subsidy estimate, and then a lot of calculations about the implicit subsidies as well. Now, considering that ODA to agriculture overall is less than $20 billion per year, I mean, the shift in political economy, I mean, caused by this significant drop in ODA, could in fact mobilize a much larger dollar amount of existing subsidies being repurposed. I think Shobha was talking about it. If you repurpose 10%, what did you say, Shobha? I think it was 4.3 trillion over the next 10 years or so. So the net effect of the political economy shifting could actually be very, very positive. So I think, you know, we need to double down on the repurposing agenda and put all our weight behind it. And also the Foundation is very interested in doing so. The second opportunity was also mentioned in the last panel is private sector financing. Of course, in the end, I mean, it was said also by the IFPRI president, I mean, you know, food systems are a private sector activity. So faced with fiscal deficits and declining ODA, so many governments will be looking now into how to crowd in private sector investments. I go back to the important recommendation that IFPRI and FOLU and the World Bank actually provided as part, you might remember, Joe, as part of our work on the finance lever of the UN Food Systems Summit in 2028, where we say that, you know, governments and the public sector and private sector can actually work on a global compact under which the repurposed public support from the governments, from the public sector is used to de-risk private sector investments in healthier, more inclusive, more resilient food systems. And on the other hand, I mean, the private sector would be matching this de-risking by raising and mainstreaming ESG standards of their investment in support of these same outcomes. And now we could also see that donor countries, I mean, the donors in the room that you said, Joe, who have now smaller ODA budgets, I mean, could come into play here because they are looking for greater leverage. So they want to move away from typical grant financing, I mean, from straightforward grant financing to kind of de-risking instruments. So it seems to me, I mean, that the time for this global compact is also there. A third opportunity mentioned as well, climate financing. A lot of, you know, World Bank has published a lot about that. Very little going to agriculture, particularly smallholder farmers. The national security argument that I mentioned earlier could help here as well. And of course, we need low-cost MRV systems. That's the missing piece of the puzzle. And at the Foundation, we are looking into ways on how we actually could support, I mean, developing those low-cost, almost real-time MRV systems. A fourth opportunity that we see was mentioned also in the last panel, I mean, concerns trade in Africa. I mean, to the extent that the shifting political economy might be generating favorable conditions for repurposing public support. Of course, the same is true when it comes to addressing the non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers that stand in the way to fully capture the benefits of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So African leaders, endorsed, the next 10-year phase of the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, CAADP, early this year, to the newly adopted Kampala Declaration. To the extent that ODA financing was critical to achieve those objectives, coordinated efforts now to unlock the benefits of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement might be one way to compensate for this drop in ODA. And in that respect, looking at the World Bank here, we could see now, that there might actually be interest and opportunities for a regional trade reform and facilitation program supported through development policy lending. And we at the foundation would actually be very interested to explore what analytical work would be needed, to provide the actionable evidence in support of such a program. So that's the fourth opportunity. And then the final one, which is somewhat out of the box, but for that reason, probably very much attuned, to the very challenging time that we're all facing. And I go back to my first argument for that, building on the notion of hybrid warfare about precision agriculture and agri-food systems as part of counter-defense systems. And of course, the link here, an obvious operational link here, is how much is the military in the world spending on food? Because you have to feed the military. So I'm wondering whether IFPRI actually has done that calculation. But I did some research, and basically the number is, that the overall spending on military is about $2.5 trillion per year. And the estimates that I come up with, how much of that is spent on food is about 17%. So you're talking about $420 billion that the military around the world actually are spending on food every year. And the question is, how can actually that be used also to kind of support the agri-food system transformation agenda? So those are the 5 opportunities. And I hope that they give some much positive food for thought in these very challenging times and help us keeping our eyes on the road. Thank you.